discussion of the categories of different types of aquatic organisms, both plants and animals, the next two groups we're going to talk about are a little strange, unusual, because both of them are organisms that grow clinging to different types of vegetation. In both cases, they're organisms that cling to the macrophytes, that is, the higher aquatic vegetation that we've talked about previously. Included in this category first is the category of PERIPHYTON. PERIPHYTON are various types of plants that grow attached or clinging to, usually, as I mentioned, the macrophytes, the lily pads, cattails, etc., but they'll also cling to sticks in the water or logs or spare tires or whatever happens to be in the water. Generally, this type of vegetation is some type of filamentous algae. And in fact, in ponds and in swamps such as we're filming in today, this kind of vegetation often looks like what we'd refer to commonly as pond scum. As I mentioned, it's usually algae, it's usually a green algae, and quite commonly it's either Spirogyra or Udogonium. Although PERIPHYTON looks rather disgusting visually, it's actually quite important to the food chain, because the larger aquatic plants, that is the macrophytes, the lily pads and cattails and Potamogeton and other types, actually don't contribute an awful lot to the food chain. These larger plants may provide protection, etc., but as far as food for the primary consumers and secondary consumers, they really don't provide that much. But the PERIPHYTON, this filamentous green algae, is readily fed on by organisms higher up in the food chain, and therefore it provides a good deal of energy for the food chain. So aesthetically, it may not look as nice as lily pads, but as far as the organisms in the swamp-type habitat or in the eulittoral areas of lakes, it does provide a lot in terms of energetics. Alfucs, the next category, is very similar to PERIPHYTON, as I mentioned, also clinging. But in this case, instead of talking about plants that cling to substrate, we're talking about animals that cling or climb on macrophytes, on lily pads, etc. In the habitat we're in today, chief organisms would be the larvae or nymphs of the damselflies and dragonflies, what we refer to as Odonata. That's the order they belong to. You're familiar with the adults flying around like little airplanes, like little B-52s, around the yard, on top of ponds and swamps, etc. The adults are good predators. So are the nymphs or larvae. They're alfucs, and they provide a major source of food for fish in this kind of habitat. Other types of animals that would be categorized as alfucs would include little selenorate type organisms closely related to jellyfish called hydra. They're small predators that attach to the stems of lily pads and other macrophytes. It can include gastropods, snails, climbing on macrophytic vegetation, and in general, basically those types of organisms. The next category of life within aquatic habitats that we want to talk about is a category that includes those organisms that live either on or in the bottom ooze. Now, it doesn't really matter whether we're talking about the ooze at the bottom of this swamp habitat or whether we're talking about the ooze 200 feet down out on the main lake of Keuka that's just behind us. That ooze supports a lot of life. The dominant life associated with benthos is bacteria. Obviously, with all this organic matter falling in the bottom, it needs to be decayed, decomposed, and the bacteria population is huge. There are other types of interesting organisms, such as tubifex. Tubifex is a worm very closely related to the garden worms we talked about previously in our lecture on annelids, and it also is a decomposer. Also, in this kind of a habitat that we're in today, you may find midge larvae or chironomids, centipedes. These midge larvae also can live in this kind of habitat and are like tube effects in a very unusual way. Both the midge larvae and the tube effects have the ability to store luxury oxygen. That is, when oxygen becomes limiting, they store luxury amounts before it disappears, and they turn a bright red. That is, they pump up their hemoglobin with oxygen. And you pull them out of the bottom sediments, and they're very red. Out on the lake further, where the water's cleaner in the sense that there's not the amount of anaerobiosis or lack of oxygen, in the deep water areas, one of the things you'll find commonly are mayflies. Now, we've talked about mayflies before in lotic habitats, and you recall that we mentioned that these are aquatic invertebrates that require high oxygen concentrations. So you certainly wouldn't find mayflies in the swamp as part of benthos. But out in the rich oxygenated ooze and the hypolimnion of the main lake in deep water, there'll be a lot of burrowing mayflies indicative of that clean habitat. That's benthos. The next category we want to discuss is an unusual category of organisms that live on the surface film of water. Now, that's something you might tend to take for granted. You think about what's either in water or in the air or on land. Well, as a matter of fact, most of them are air-breathing organisms. That is, they have a tracheal system for respiration and not gills, so they're not truly aquatic organisms. We're discussing them with aquatic categories because they spend their time basically on water and diving into water from time to time. Probably the best known of the NEUSTON is an insect that looks very much like a spider. And in fact, it's called a water strider. You can tell it's an insect and not a spider or an arachnid because it has 6 legs. Other types, and by the way, you've seen them, excuse me, before I leave the striders, you've seen them running across the top of water looking very spider-like. They're predators. They're feeding on small organisms on the surface film. Other types of NEUSTON are the whirligig beetles that you see going around in circles very rapidly in streams and pools or in corners and lakes, in coves. Water boatmen also belong to this category as well. Also a very unusual type called backstriders. All of these are NEUSTON living on the surface film. Most of them are predators. The last category we want to mention are the NEKTON. Now, excluding such things as frogs or snakes that spend, or salamanders that spend a little bit of time in water, in and out, basically NEKTON is fish. And we don't have to talk about fish at this point because we're going to talk about a lot more about them in future lectures.